You talk about trade being front and center, but of course the issue right now is President Trump himself didn't turn up at a time when trade is front and center, and the region wants some clarity and commitment from him. What do you make of his absence? Was it a mistake?
Oh, look, ultimately leaders make a call around their presence at the various and different forums that are available at any given time. I think having the presence of the Vice President also incredibly important, and leaders will be making the most of that contact and that opportunity to have a conversation around, the importance of ASEAN, the success of ASEAN, but also some of the ambition as well. For instance, the RCEP trade agreement, which is something that's been a hot topic of conversation for all of us.
Speaking of the Vice President, you were seated next to him at dinner at his request. What did you discuss?
Oh, again, totally self-interested. I use every opportunity I can to promote the benefits of free trade, particularly from a country like New Zealand's perspective. We're a trading nation. We're geographically isolated but heavily linked to the world through our trading ties. And for us, maintaining that rules-based order, incredibly important. But that does mean that we've got a job to do domestically as well. APEC nations in particular have been discussing for a couple of years now, how do we create greater inclusion and prosperity from our trade agendas? How do we ensure that more and more people benefit from trade? Because we have seen, I think, in some corners of the world, a bit of a pushback domestically from people who don't see those benefits, who see the cost of globalisation to them. We're trying to rebuild that mandate through a trade for all agenda. And really, I'm just simply trying to promote that if we follow a rules-based order, follow the trade rules we've agreed to and expand those trade options, but take upon ourselves the domestic responsibility to see everyone's well-being lifted, then that's a recipe for success.
Did you manage to convince the U.S. to make an exemption when it comes to steel and aluminum?
Steel and aluminum, yeah.
That's a big issue.
I'm such a broken record on it, and I use every opportunity I have to raise it. Because, of course, there's been raised by the United States the issue of those who are in trade deficit or surplus, and we happen to be one of those countries where the United States does well in their trade with us. And so, I did raise it, but it was a conversation amongst many other things.
Did you bring up the issue of CPTPP? I mean, did you try to convince the U.S. to rejoin the trade?
When it came to CPTPP, for me, it's about actually talking about the journey that we went on. Actually, there was a view within our domestic population that CPTPP was a very different trade agreement. There were bits of it that we had concerns about. When we took office, we came in with a view that we would do our best to rebalance the agreement, and we reached a place where we were happy with that rebalancing. But off the back,
it's a different deal without the U.S.
It is a different deal without the U.S. And if they chose to re-enter, there would be a negotiation off the back of that.
Do you get a sense that the U.S. may be interested at some point to rejoin CPTPP?
That wasn't the nature of my conversation. I haven't seen anything that really suggests that. I do still see a focus from them on bilateral trade rather than multilateral trade agreements. But regardless, from our perspective, multilateral works for us. When you're a small trading nation, that's often how you reap the big rewards.
You talked about RCEP earlier. Yeah. It's been stalled. Countries like China and Singapore wanted to push through by the end of this year, but that's not likely to be end of next year. Yeah. What caused the stall?
Yeah, look, we are looking into 2019, and my understanding is we've got roughly 7 chapters that are looking good, but I think there is still a bit more conversation to be had around services and investment. From our perspective, it's always about balancing pace with quality. And we do want to see that there's additional benefits derived from RCEP, and so that's why we'll keep pushing to bank what's already been negotiated, lock that in, but see if we can push a little bit further. But it is a significant agreement, and again, I think we'll demonstrate the benefit that can be derived in this region from us having those multilateral agreements.
Is there concern that RCEP is being driven by China?
No. Look, that's not a concern. Certainly from our perspective, our concern is, as I say, making sure that we don't sacrifice quality simply for pace, particularly given it's had a lengthy gestation. We might as well derive the most from it that we can.
Okay, RCEP, CPTPP, can they coexist?
Oh, yes, currently, absolutely. And I think the conversation about the two is whether or not we're building on CPTPP for those member nations via RCEP. But yeah, absolutely.
Are there concerns down the road? I mean, when do you see the other member nations joining RCEP? Because right now the signatories are pretty limited.
Oh, and yet it will be one of the most significant multilateral agreements in terms of the membership base, in terms of the value of what it will cover. And I think often, perhaps for those who are who haven't ratified or aren't part of those agreements, they'll look to see what benefits are derived from them. Certainly, I imagine that will probably be the case for CPTPP.
Prime Minister, what are your views on the U.S. China trade? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? I mean, what are the indications are you getting in your conversations with the rest of the global leaders?
Certainly, at least from a domestic perspective, I think it is having. It is having an effect in the sense that business confidence might be somewhat affected by looking out and seeing what's happening as a result of the trade conversations going on, that it might be having an impact on global growth. From our perspective, we want to make sure that if the world sneezes, New Zealand doesn't catch a cold. So, but there's also something to be said for the architecture that we sign up to around trade. We see no benefit for tit-for-tat trade wars. So for us, we'll keep pushing hard around really abiding by those trade rules and agreements and norms that we've signed up to.
We also have heard of late what's called the Pacific Reset.
Yes.
New Zealand seems to be more engaged in the Pacific. What's the thinking behind that? Is it a way of perhaps balancing the increasing influence from China?
And I've had that a question raised with me a lot, and actually it's actually more about us. We are a member of the Pacific. We have a very unique relationship with members of Pacific nations resident in New Zealand, but equally, of course, us having close connections, realm countries, constitutional arrangements. We've simply said, actually, on that basis, we've got to move away from this donor relationship that New Zealand's had historically. And
what's prompting that
partnership?
thought?
Well, actually, it's just the values that we as a government have brought. We should, being embedded within the region, it should be about partnership. We benefit when the Pacific does well, both economically and socially. We have a responsibility on issues like climate change to be real advocates alongside the Pacific. So we said, look, now's the time to actually reshape our relationship, because that's how we see our relationship with the Pacific.
So is there no concern at all that China is perhaps more engaged in that part of the world, investing a lot through its Belt and Road Initiative, pumping a lot of money?
Yeah, there is a change in the presence of a range of different actors in the Pacific. But that actually shouldn't be the basis on which we reflect on our own relationship. That is actually about us. It's about the Pacific, and it's about us doing our bit.
Let's talk about the New Zealand economy. Property, housing is one of the huge issues there. Since you came to power, you've banned the sale of residential properties to foreigners. Has that worked, and where do you see that policy headed?
Yeah, and I see that as simply us bringing ourselves into alignment with a number of other nations which we would compare ourselves to, the likes of Australia, for instance. And I think probably what's surprising isn't so much that we've brought this ban in, it's that it didn't exist in the first place. It's also a way that we really want to send a message that New Zealand is open to investment. We
There's
encourage,
a but there.
The only but is we want it to be productive. And actually we derive, and I'd say investors derive, I think, much greater benefit for investing in our productive economy than just our housing market. So our hope is that by setting around some ground rules around residential housing, which was ballooning out of control price-wise, but saying actually in terms of infrastructure, in terms of things like hotels, transport, we absolutely need quality foreign direct investment in New Zealand, and we are open for business.
So in terms of pricing, you're for lower prices then?
Is that
what you're hoping? Yes.
Well, actually, I mean, we've got both a supply issue and a demand issue. So the foreign residential buyer issue, that was about dealing with demand. On supply, we've said the market's failed. We're not supplying enough homes that will fall in the category of first home buyers. So we as a state are now partnering with developers, making sure we're putting a bit more supply in that area to try and ease the heat that's in the market.
You're looking for more affordable housing. You're looking
Absolutely.
to build 100,000 homes, for instance. Is that overly ambitious? Some say it is.
Some say it is overly ambitious, and it ramps up over time. So we're looking at 16,000 in our first 3 years, and then really using for instance, some of the prefab technologies and so on to try and ramp up that production. It is ambitious, but I would rather step into that failed market and give it a go than stand back and say, well, look, we just have to give up the idea of home ownership for people.
So for cities like Auckland, where home prices are in excess of $1 million, that is a cause for concern for you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in terms of housing affordability, we're ranking very poorly, and yet so much of our some of our values as Kiwis has always been the idea of home ownership, and I want that for whoever has a right to live in New Zealand, whoever chooses to call New Zealand home. So I'm not giving up on that, because that's how people build their links. It's how they build their community ties. Their kids remain in the same place in education. So much around our quality urban development is around the quality of the communities that we build. So that's something I'm really focused on.
You talked about climate change.
Yes.
That's a huge issue for you as well. What are targets? What are the priorities for you?
Yeah, and look, we've signed up to the Paris Agreement. We've seen what the IPCC has been telling us about 1.5 degrees. We're trying to establish within New Zealand a mechanism to establish targets that endure beyond political cycles through our zero carbon bill. Mm-hmm. We're working on that at the moment, but in the intervening period, we've said we're striving towards carbon neutrality by 2050. We want to have electricity generation completely renewable by 2035. We've established a green infrastructure fund to try and really encourage private investment in new technologies, because we've got a lot of work to do on transportation.
Will that eventually involve getting rid of fossil fuel vehicles, and how do you get everybody on board? What's the plan?
Globally, I've seen a big shift, particularly in Europe, with a focus on vehicles. For us, we actually at the moment just don't have the infrastructure, and again, play here for those who are interested in investment in New Zealand, the transport infrastructure that gives our commuters alternatives. So we've already said we want to invest in rail from our biggest city to the airport, to make sure that we have those alternatives there. A much bigger issue for our emissions profile is, alongside transport, is actually agricultural emissions. So our food production and methane emissions make up roughly 50% of our emissions profile. That makes us fairly unique in the world. We want to ensure that we are the most sustainable, most productive, highest quality and most trustworthy food producer in the world. And so on the climate challenge, we'll be looking for ways to demonstrate that through our new technology and new ways of farming.
Prime Minister, just one final question. I'm sure you've heard this over and over again, that you are the youngest female Prime Minister. What's your advice to the millennials listening to you out there?
That politics, I think, for a number of years has not necessarily been the aspiration of many, but it is a place where you can make remarkable change. And I would just really encourage people who might look to political leadership and not see themselves in that, to say you can carve your own path, be your own kind of leader, and we do need to create a new generation of leadership, one where you can bring empathy and kindness and whatever traits you value to the job.